The Thornbury drawing room held 30 people, and the particular stillness of a house party on its third evening, when the novelty of company had worn smooth and the real conversations were beginning. Lady Vivienne Lacey stood near the east window with a glass of negus she had not touched, watching the room the way she always watched rooms, cataloging, adjusting, noting who needed redirecting before they said something they would regret. She was good at this. She had been good at this since she was 14 years old, and her mother died, and her father said, "You are the steady one." And she had understood, even then, that steadiness was not a quality he was admiring so much as a duty he was assigning. She was still standing at that window, 28 years old and very steady indeed, when Lord Cassius Blackwood crossed the room toward her, with the particular directness of a man who has decided to say something and will not be talked out of it. She saw him coming. She did not move. "Lady Vivienne," Cassius said. He did not bother with preamble. "I believe there is something you and I should discuss." Vivienne turned from the window and looked at him with the pleasant, attentive expression she had perfected over 14 years of managing people who did not know they were being managed. "Your Grace," she said, "of course." He was 31 and built like a man who had spent his youth at Eton learning that directness was its own form of courtesy. He had dark eyes and the kind of stillness that was not calm but contained. A man holding something in, not a man at peace. He glanced once at the room around them, at the card tables and the clusters of conversation. And then he looked back at her and said it plainly. "Theodora and I are in love." Vivienne held his gaze. She did not blink. She did not look away toward the fire or toward the window or toward any of the 30 other people in the room. She said, "I know." Cassius went very still. "You know," he repeated. "I introduced you," Vivienne said. "Both of them. I introduced Theodora to Nathaniel at the midsummer ball 18 months ago. I was aware of what I was doing." "On purpose," Cassius said. She answered plainly, "Yes." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out to her without speaking, and she took it because there was nothing else to do. She unfolded it and looked at it in the light from the nearest candelabra. It was a seating chart, the midsummer ball seating arrangement, written in her own hand, the ink slightly faded now with time. She recognized the paper before she read a word of it. She had written it herself. She found Cassius's name near the top of the second table. Beside it, in the same ink, her own name. And then a single firm line through it. Through her name only. Cassius's name remained. In a different, slightly darker hand, she had gone back to the chart, she remembered, on the morning of the ball. Theodora's name appeared in the space where hers had been. Vivienne read the chart carefully. She set it down on the small table beside her. She picked up her glass of negus, which she had not intended to drink, and took a single sip. "Where did you find that?" she asked. "Nathaniel," Cassius said. She nodded once, as though this answered a question she had already worked out for herself. Then she said, "If you will excuse me." And she set her glass down beside the seating chart and walked out of the drawing room with the unhurried composure of a woman who has nowhere in particular to go and is in no particular distress about it. Cassius watched her leave. He stood beside the table with the seating chart and the untouched glass of negus and the particular sensation of a man who has just confirmed something he was not entirely certain he wanted confirmed. He had expected argument. He had expected explanation or denial, or the bright social deflection she deployed so effortlessly in rooms like this one. He had not expected her to read the chart, set it down, and excuse herself as though he had merely reminded her of a prior engagement. She had not defended herself. She had not explained. She had looked at the evidence of her own deliberate act and walked away from it without a word of justification. He picked up the seating chart and folded it back into his coat. Around him, the card games continued. Someone laughed at the far end of the room. The fire settled in the grate with a soft collapse of embers. He went to find Nathaniel. The billiard room was at the back of the house, away from the party sounds, and Nathaniel Holt was there alone, running a practiced shot along the near cushion with the ease of a man who had been playing since boyhood. He looked up when Cassius entered and read something in his face that made him straighten and set down the cue. "She took it well?" Nathaniel asked. "She said she knew," Cassius said. "She said she introduced them on purpose. Then she left the room." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He moved to the side of the table and leaned against it, arms folded, studying Cassius with the expression of a man who has been deciding how much to say for some time, and has now decided. "I am going to tell you 2 things," Nathaniel said, "and I want you to listen to both of them before you say anything." Cassius stood in the doorway. "Go on." "The introduction was deliberate," Nathaniel said. "You already know that. She arranged it. The seating, the introduction, the conversation she steered me into with Theodora about the Botanical Society. She did not leave any of it to chance. Every element of that evening was placed." "I know," Cassius said. "The second thing," Nathaniel said, "is this. Over the past 18 months, Vivienne has removed herself from every room you entered. Not every room I entered. Yours." Cassius said nothing. "The theater box she gave up in November," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady and deliberate. "You were in the adjacent box. She told Mrs. Farley she had a headache and redirected the invitation to the Ashworths. The Christmas invitation to Pemberton Hall. She declined it the morning after she learned you would be attending. She told my aunt she was needed at Farringdon for the tenants' accounts." Nathaniel paused. "The seating adjustments at the Worthington dinner, the Cavendish supper, the Alderton assembly, and the March dinner at Thornbury. 4 occasions. I watched her do it. She placed herself at the opposite end of every table from where you were seated." Cassius was standing very still now. The billiard room was cold, the fire had been left low, and the quiet of it pressed against the sounds of the party somewhere in the house behind him. "She was managing proximity," Cassius said slowly. "She was managing her own proximity," Nathaniel said. "To you, not to me." He let that sit for a moment. "I have been watching this for 1.5 years, Cassius. I am not performing ignorance when I tell you that the geometry you have been drawing is wrong." Cassius moved into the room and sat down in the chair beside the fireplace. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked at the low fire for a long moment. "I believed she loved you," he said. "I believed she built the match to keep you close, that Theodora was the mechanism and you were the reason." "I know what you believed," Nathaniel said without unkindness. "You were wrong." Cassius looked up at him. "Then why did she introduce them?" "I don't know," Nathaniel said. "But I know it was not because of me." He picked up the billiard cue again and turned it in his hands, not to play with it, but because it gave his hands something to hold. "She has been very careful for 18 months, very deliberate. I am telling you what I observed, not what I understand." Cassius stood. He picked up his coat from the chair back and stood with it in his hands and said nothing. Then he walked to the door. "Cassius," Nathaniel said. He stopped. She crossed out her own name. Nathaniel said. Not yours. Cassius left the billiard room without answering. The library at Thornbury was empty in the early morning. Cassius had been there since 6 o'clock, when the house was still quiet and the only sounds were the distant movement of servants and the wind off the heathland coming through the old window frames. He had the seating chart on the table in front of him, smooth flat, and he had been looking at it for the better part of an hour. He went back through 18 months with the new geometry Nathaniel had given him and rebuilt what he had seen. The theater box. He had assumed she gave it up because Nathaniel was otherwise engaged that evening, and proximity to him was the point. He had not registered until now that he himself had been in the adjacent box. The Christmas invitation. He had assumed she stayed at Farringdon out of duty. He had not thought to connect her refusal to his own presence on the guest list. The 4 dinner seating adjustments. He had watched her orchestrate them with such smooth social ease that he had read them as hospitality, not flight. Every gesture he had read as devotion to Nathaniel now rearranged itself. Not proximity to Nathaniel, distance from himself. He sat back in the library chair and looked at the crossed-out name on the chart. Her name in her hand, replaced by Theodora's. His name untouched. She had placed herself beside him and then removed herself. He was still sitting with this when, across the house, in the small room she had been given overlooking the east garden, Vivienne sat at her writing desk with a letter she had begun 3 times and could not finish. She was not writing to Cassius. She was not writing to anyone in particular. She had begun with "Dear" and stopped because she did not know who she was writing to, only that she needed to put something down on paper before it accumulated further inside her chest, where she had been keeping it. She had been keeping it for 14 months, to be precise. Since the house party at Alderton, where she had watched Cassius spend 40 minutes with Theodora over a botanical illustration of Dorset heathland. She had been standing near the fireplace, close enough to see the way he laughed, a real laugh, not a social one, and the way Theodora's hand had rested on his arm with the ease of someone entirely comfortable, and the way he had leaned in to look at the illustration more closely, and the way the conversation had continued and continued and continued, and she had counted because she could not help it. She had known immediately what she was seeing. She had been entirely certain. She had thought, of course it is Theodora. Anyone would choose Theodora. And then she had gone home to Farringdon and spent 3 weeks being the steady one. And at the end of those 3 weeks, she had written a seating chart for the midsummer ball and placed her own name beside Cassius's, and then looked at it for a long time and crossed it out. She had not introduced Theodora to Nathaniel because she thought they would suit. They did suit, genuinely, properly, in the way that made the match feel clean. But that was not why she had done it. She had done it because she believed Cassius was falling in love with Theodora, and she could not bear to watch it happen from nearby, and the only way she knew to stop watching was to give Theodora somewhere else to look. She set down her pen. The letter remained unfinished. Outside, the east garden was gray and damp in the early morning light, and the heathland beyond the estate wall stretched away toward the horizon in the colors Theodora drew so well. Both of them were sitting in separate rooms with wrong conclusions built from the same evening, and neither of them knew yet that the other was also wrong. The chessboard appeared in the Thornbury drawing room on the 4th morning of the house party, placed on a low table between 2 armchairs that had been pulled at Cassius's instruction to the footman, though he had framed it as a general arrangement, slightly closer to the fire than was strictly necessary. Vivienne noticed the placement when she came in from the morning room and found him already seated, The pieces set, looking at her with the expression of a man extending a social courtesy that both of them understood, was something else entirely. "I thought you might want a game," Cassius said. "How considerate," Vivienne said, and sat down. The fire was strong, and the room was otherwise occupied. Lady Pemberton at the pianoforte, 3 gentlemen with newspapers, Mrs. Alderton in conversation with her daughter near the window. The chess game was entirely plausible. Vivienne opened with her pawns, and Cassius responded, and for the first 20 minutes, they played in the comfortable silence of 2 people who know what they are doing and are not yet ready to say so. Then she moved her bishop in a line that contradicted her previous 3 moves. And Cassius looked at it for a moment and said, "You have been reading Cicero." "I have been reading Cicero for 15 years, Vivienne said. "That move is from the Tusculan Disputations," Cassius said. "The argument about virtue as its own sufficient reward. You are sacrificing material advantage on the assumption that the position will justify itself. And you disagree with the position," Vivienne said. "I disagree with Cicero," Cassius said. "Virtue is not its own sufficient reward. It is a sufficient guide. The reward is a separate matter entirely." "That is a remarkably practical reading of a Stoic text," Vivienne said. "It is an honest reading," Cassius said. "Cicero was writing to console himself after his daughter died. He was not writing a philosophy. He was writing a reason to get up in the morning." Vivienne looked at him across the chessboard. Something in the way he said it, the specific, undefended plainness of it, made her set down the piece she had been about to move. "You think the consolation is dishonest," she said. "I think the consolation is necessary," Cassius said. "That is not the same as honest. Most people would not distinguish between the two when the grief is fresh enough." "Most people," Cassius said, "are not writing philosophy. They are surviving." He moved his knight. "Your bishop is exposed." She looked at the board. He was right. She had not seen it. She was reaching for her knight to cover the exposure when his hand came down on the same square. Not slowly, not deliberately, simply at the same moment, from the same direction, with the same intention. Her fingers landed on his. She pulled back immediately. He did not. He left his hand on the square for 3 full seconds. She counted, because she could not help counting. And then he moved the knight himself, placing it where she had intended. "Your move," he said. She looked at the board. She looked at his hand, which was now resting on his knee as though nothing had happened. She moved her queen's pawn and said nothing. They played for another half-hour. She won, narrowly, by a margin she suspected he had allowed, though she could not prove it and did not ask. That afternoon, the drawing room filled again after luncheon, and Vivienne was standing near the window when Nathaniel appeared beside her with the particular directness of a man who has decided to say something publicly because he has calculated that a public setting makes it harder to deflect. "Lady Vivienne," Nathaniel said, at a volume that was conversational but not private, "I have been meaning to ask you something." Around them, 4 guests. Mrs. Alderton, her daughter, Sir William Farley, and young Mr. Pemberton, all within easy earshot, all now oriented, with the subtle animal awareness of people in a room, toward the conversation. "Of course," Vivienne said. "The introduction at the midsummer ball," Nathaniel said pleasantly. "Between Theodora and myself. I have always been curious. What else was your motive? You placed us together very deliberately. Theodora tells me the seating, the introduction, even the topic of conversation was your arrangement." Vivienne held her pleasant expression, with the steadiness of a woman who had been doing exactly this since she was 14. She opened her mouth. "Nathaniel," Cassius said from across the room. His voice was easy, unhurried, the tone of a man making a social observation rather than an interruption. "Did you see the Farley watercolor in the hall? The one of the northern coast? I have been trying to identify the location, and I think you would know it." Sir William Farley looked up with immediate interest. "There is a watercolor of the northern coast?" "Just outside the library," Cassius said. "I noticed it this morning." The attention in the room shifted. Sir William was already moving. Mrs. Alderton followed, with her daughter. Mr. Pemberton said something about watercolors and moved toward the door. Nathaniel looked at Cassius for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise. And then he smiled, and he went. Vivienne stood at the window and said nothing. The room emptied around the question Nathaniel had asked, and the question went with it, unanswered, into the hall. She found him on the terrace 10 minutes later. The evening was cold, the terrace stones were damp from the afternoon's rain, and Cassius was standing at the balustrade looking out at the darkening garden with his coat collar turned up and the posture of a man who has been waiting to be followed and is not surprised to hear footsteps. "You changed the subject," Vivienne said. "I did," Cassius said. "In front of 4 people," she said. "You redirected the entire room." He answered simply, "Yes. Why?" He turned to look at her. The last of the evening light was behind the tree line, and his face was in shadow. But she could see the steadiness in it, the contained quality she had noticed the first time she ever spoke to him, years ago, before the house party at Alderton, before she had understood what she felt. "You were not ready," he said. The words landed on her in a way she had not expected. Not the content of them, but the certainty, the plain, unapologetic certainty of a man who had looked at her face and made a decision. "How could you know what I am ready for?" she said. "I do not know," Cassius said. "I know what an ambush looks like." Nathaniel asked that question with 4 witnesses because he calculated that you would not deflect in front of 4 witnesses. He was right. You would not have. He paused. "I redirected the room, and because I did not want you cornered, that is all." Vivienne stood at the edge of the terrace and looked at him, and said nothing for a long moment. The garden below them was going dark, the hedgerows losing their definition against the sky. "I have been deflecting for 18 months, she said finally. "One more room would not have been unusual." "No," Cassius said, "but it would have been public. And whatever the answer is, it should not be public first." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them moved toward the door. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who have run out of the particular conversation they were having and have not yet decided whether to begin a different one. The cold pressed in around them. A light appeared in an upstairs window. Somewhere inside the house, someone played 3 notes on the pianoforte and stopped. They stood there for another full minute. Then Vivienne said good evening and went inside, and Cassius stayed on the terrace and watched the last light leave the garden. The following evening, the chessboard was still in the drawing room, and they sat down to it again without discussion, as though it had been agreed between them at some point neither could identify. The other guests moved around them, conversation, cards, the pianoforte again, and Vivienne and Cassius played in the quiet at the center of it all. She had been playing the same defensive structure for 3 games. Cassius had been accommodating it, Not because he could not break it, she suspected, but because he was watching it. This evening, midway through the middle game, she set up a gambit and then did not execute it. She had the piece in her hand, and she put it back. Cassius looked at the board, and then at her. "You do that," he said. "You build toward a commitment and then withdraw. It is not strategy." "What is it then?" she asked. "I do not know yet," he said, "but it is consistent." She did not deny it. She sat with her hand near the chess queen, the piece she had not moved in 3 games, the piece she kept protecting without advancing, and she said nothing. Cassius reached across the board. He placed his hand over hers, steadying the queen she had been hovering her fingers above without touching. His palm was warm against her knuckles. She felt the contact travel up her arm, and she did not pull away. He held 3 seconds. She was trembling. She knew it. A fine tremor in her fingers she could not entirely account for. Something that had been building in her since the garden walk that morning and the conversation with Theodora about pressed flowers and a child named Cecily who had died at 11. He felt the tremor. She saw it register in his face, a slight change in his attention, a shift from the chess game to her hand. He did not ask about it. He released her hand and moved his own piece and said, "Your turn." She looked at the queen she had not moved. She left it where it was. Theodora Sinclair walked the way she did everything, with a kind of bright, forward momentum that made it difficult not to follow her. She had been talking for several minutes about the Botanical Society in Bath, and Vivienne had been listening with the attentive ease of long practice, and the garden path wound ahead of them between the late-season roses toward the heathland wall. "He was very sweet about it, actually," Theodora said. "I showed him the sketch, the Dorset heathland, you remember, the one I did at Alderton, and he laughed. Properly laughed, which was lovely because he's not always easy to make laugh. And then he went quiet." Vivienne kept walking. "He apologized," Theodora continued, "which I thought was odd because he had done nothing wrong. And then he explained. His younger sister. Cecily, I think her name was. She used to collect pressed flowers, apparently. Pressed heather, specifically. She died very young. A fever, he said, while he was away at school. He came home and found her flower press still open on the nursery table." Vivienne stopped walking. Theodora had continued 2 or 3 steps before she noticed and turned back. "I found it terribly moving," she said. "He laughed because my heather looked the way she pressed it. Badly, too much stem. That was what he said. Too much stem." She smiled. He apologized for going quiet. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. Vivienne stood on the garden path and looked at the heathland beyond the estate wall. 40 minutes. She had counted every one. The laughter and the conversation and Theodora's hand on his arm, and the way he had leaned in to look at the illustration. She had read it with complete certainty in the space of 30 seconds and built 14 months of decisions on top of it. The laughter had been grief. The 40 minutes had been a dead child's pressed flowers. The hand on his arm had been Theodora, steadying a man who had not expected to feel what he felt. She stood on the path and let this settle through her, layer by layer, the way cold water moves through a room when a window is opened in winter. She had redirected 3 lives. Theodora's courtship, Nathaniel's marriage, her own future, because she had misread a man mourning his 11-year-old sister. Ahead of her, Theodora had resumed walking, talking now about the Botanical Society's winter exhibition, her voice warm and easy and entirely unaware.